Welcome to Mental Flight, where bold ideas take off and untold truths soar beyond the limits of ordinary thinking. Then fasten your mind, you're cleared for takeoff. In a storm of tactical precision and uncompromising resolve, the Sahel region witnessed a dramatic 4 to 8 hour operation that will go down as one of the most decisive blows to the criminal underworld in West Africa. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, Burkina Faso's revolutionary leader known for his iron-willed anti-imperialist stance, joined forces with Interpol in a mission that turned the tide against one of the most entrenched drug empires operating across the region. The Sahel, long plagued by instability, porous borders, and ungoverned spaces, has served as fertile ground for transnational narcotics networks. These syndicates have not only fueled corruption and insurgency, but have also undermined sovereignty by weaving their influence into state institutions. This time, however, they faced a force unlike any before. The operation began with intelligence. Gathered over months, a web of informants, surveillance drones, intercepted communications, and strategic infiltration revealed the architecture of a drug empire that stretched from Mali to Niger. Using Burkina Faso as a key trafficking corridor, cocaine shipments from South America, heroin from the Middle East, and synthetic drugs manufactured in unregulated West African labs were being moved in armored convoys under the protection of rogue military elements and foreign mercenaries. Traoré, known for his muscular build, military background, and sharp geopolitical instincts, authorized the deployment of elite Burkina commandos to work side by side with Interpol operatives. The goal was not just arrest it was complete dismantlement. What followed was an orchestrated blitz. In Wahiguya, a suspected logistics hub, commandos raided a fortified warehouse where they found over 3 tons of narcotics and millions in unmarked currency, Dory. A high-speed pursuit ended with the interception of a convoy disguised as humanitarian aid. The drug empire had been using fake NGOs and relief organizations to mask their roots. On the outskirts of Fata Nguma, a villa housing foreign advisors and satellite equipment was seized, revealing encrypted maps, drone footage of border patrol routes, and financial ledgers that connected this empire to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. The exposure of this network sent shockwaves beyond Africa. European law enforcement, long accused of turning a blind eye to Sahel trafficking routes so long as the drugs didn't land on their soil, could no longer deny the systemic failure. For decades, the Sahel was treated as a buffer zone, a place where destabilization was allowed to fester so long as Western geopolitical interests remained unchallenged. But this crackdown changed everything. Traoré's leadership throughout the mission was direct and unrelenting. His stance was clear. The Sahel would no longer be a playground for foreign intelligence, war profiteers, and drug lords. He appeared at the nerve center of operations, reviewing intelligence on digital tablets, giving orders in real time, and even participating in briefings with Interpol's global teams via secure satellite channels. This was more than just a military success. It was a symbolic declaration that Africa would no longer tolerate being the staging ground for silent wars, funded by drugs and masked by diplomacy. By the end of the 48 hours, dozens of high-value arrests were made. Hundreds of kilos of narcotics were destroyed, bank accounts were frozen, and a loud message echoed across the continent. The era of impunity is over. The media blackout that surrounded the mission added to its shock effect. When footage of the raids finally surfaced, it showed hooded soldiers moving with lethal efficiency, seizing crates marked with foreign languages, and pulling down flags of fake organizations. One clip showed Traoré standing in front of a burned drug stockpile, vowing in a deep, commanding voice that Burkina Faso would no longer be a gateway for foreign greed and domestic betrayal. Interpol released a rare public commendation, praising the coordination and courage shown by the Burkina forces. Western intelligence agencies, caught off guard by the success and speed of the mission, scrambled to reassess their presence in the region. Several officials suspected of providing cover to drug-linked operations quietly removed from embassy posts in the days that followed. The shockwaves are still being felt. Other African nations have begun seeking strategic partnerships modeled After this operation, the people, long disillusioned by years of empty reforms and foreign-directed security policies, have seen something different: action, sovereignty, and courage from within. What took place in those 48 hours wasn't just a drug bust. It was the unleashing of a new doctrine of African security, authored by Africans and enforced by those unwilling to sell their soil for silence, in one of the most daring crackdowns. In recent African history, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the young and commanding leader of Burkina Faso, joined forces with Interpol to execute a swift and deadly 48-hour raid that dismantled one of the Sahel's most dangerous drug trafficking empires. This operation was not just a tactical success, but a bold demonstration of Africa's growing resolve to dismantle transnational criminal networks, operating in its soil under the shadows of global indifference. The mission was executed with military precision and intelligence collaboration across borders, resulting in an intelligence-driven strike that exposed the sheer depth and reach of the Sahel's narco empire. What made this operation even more significant was the element of complete surprise. There were no leaks, no advance warnings, and no room for escape. Within 2 days, high-ranking drug lords, rogue security operatives, corrupt customs officers, and local collaborators were rounded up in coordinated arrests across Burkina Faso, Mali, and parts of Niger. The seizures included massive hauls of cocaine, heroin, synthetic opioids, military-grade weapons, encrypted communication devices, and millions in various currencies. The operation began after months of surveillance, signal tracking, and intelligence mapping, which had identified the movement of cartel operatives across porous borders. Traoré, known for his fearless and nationalist leadership style, had made it clear to his intelligence units that Burkina Faso would no longer serve as a corridor for Western-backed cartels and their African collaborators. What Interpol brought to the table was a global network of databases, financial crime units, and the technical sophistication required to penetrate encrypted supply chains and offshore laundering systems. Interpol's analysts worked alongside Burkina's special forces, providing satellite intelligence, suspicious financial transfer reports, and tracking of diplomatic vehicles used for trafficking under immunity protection. During the raid, a joint task force stormed warehouses disguised as humanitarian aid facilities. What they found inside shocked even the most seasoned officers. Containers of narcotics had been stored alongside food supplies bearing logos of international aid groups, many of which were traced to shell companies headquartered in tax havens. The logistics trail revealed a horrifying truth. Parts of Africa's humanitarian corridors were being exploited by criminal syndicates with ties to private security, contractors, and foreign intelligence services. Traoré's administration wasted no time in exposing these networks. State media broadcast footage of the seized goods and arrested individuals, sending a clear message that the days of impunity were over. This was not merely a drug bust. It was a full-scale geopolitical statement. By collaborating directly with Interpol, Traoré bypassed compromised regional institutions and invoked international legal frameworks to ensure swift extraditions, asset freezes, and red notices on cartel-linked financiers residing abroad. For the first time, a sovereign African government had taken the offensive in the war on drugs. It's not by waiting for foreign powers to intervene, but by leading the charge with its own vision, troops, and strategic alliances. The public reaction in Burkina Faso was immediate and electrifying. Traoré's approval rating soared as ordinary citizens praised the government's courage to confront an invisible but deeply entrenched enemy. Mothers whose children had been lost to drug addiction flooded social media with messages of support. Communities in border regions, long terrorized by cartel-linked militias, began forming civilian intelligence circles to report suspicious activity. Traoré's security doctrine, built on grassroots involvement and military discipline, had finally delivered a victory that was felt from the capital to the most remote villages. Even more remarkable was the global response. Nations long skeptical of Africa's capability to police its own affairs were forced to acknowledge the operational excellence and moral clarity of the 48-hour blitz. Regional leaders inspired by Burkina Faso's example requested access to the intelligence report This operation revealed another deeper layer of Traoré's leadership style. He wasn't just reacting to threats, he was setting new terms for engagement. By involving Interpol, he demonstrated that Burkina Faso could be both sovereign and globally engaged, capable of choosing its partners based on national interest rather than neo-colonial alignment. The mission also highlighted the evolution of African warfare no longer fought solely on battlefields, but in data rooms, cyber networks, satellite feeds, and intelligence files. It was a war of strategy, secrecy, and psychological dominance. And Traoré had just proven that African command centers could be as advanced and formidable as any in the world. While the 48-hour raid was over in terms of field operations, its ripple effects had just begun. Financial networks were being traced. More names were being added to watch lists. Politicians once believed untouchable were now being questioned. With this single strike, Traoré and Interpol not only dismantled a narco empire, but redefined what African-led justice can look like when powered by conviction, strategy, and international cooperation on Africa's own terms. The 48-hour operation, launched by Captain Ibrahim Traoré and Interpol, didn't just arrest drug traffickers. It ripped apart the veil concealing a much deeper and more sinister network of corruption, manipulation, and exploitation. This was not simply a local drug cartel operating in isolation. It was an entire criminal ecosystem, foreign-backed, globally, financed, and politically protected. At the heart of this empire were foreign intelligence-linked cartels, using the Sahel as a transit corridor for narcotics bound for Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Asia. These operations had long relied on Burkina Faso's instability, porous borders, and corruptible institutions. What Traoré's raid did was lift the curtain on the machinery behind the chaos of machinery designed, funded and shielded by entities that claimed to be working for Africa's benefit, as special forces raided cartel compounds, intercepted encrypted communications, and seized financial documents. They uncovered something shocking. Many of the organizations used to move drugs, launder money, and transport arms weren't rogue gangs. They were registered NGOs, charities, and so-called humanitarian missions operating under the pretext of aiding displaced populations. These fake NGOs were using international funding platforms, donor grants, and diplomatic clearances to ship contraband across the Sahel. Under the guise of delivering aid, they were smuggling synthetic opioids, cocaine, and even biological precursors. For meth production, these were not accidental lapses in oversight. These were premeditated operations using the language of humanitarianism to mask deeply criminal agendas. Burkina cyber intelligence teams working with Interpol's digital forensics units decrypted laptops and hard drives found during the raids. What they discovered was a web of offshore shell companies operating out of jurisdictions like the Cayman Islands, Dubai, Cyprus, and Luxembourg. These companies had complex ownership structures that led back to individuals in diplomatic circles, ex-military personnel, and executives from major multinational contractors operating across West Africa. Millions of dollars in laundered funds were being funneled through fake development projects, educational initiatives, and refugee relief programs. Much of this money ended up in real estate, luxury cars, and high-level bribes to officials across the region. The financial trail stretched far beyond Burkina Faso. It touched banks in Paris, accounts in Geneva, and investments in Doha. The NGOs involved weren't just money mules. Some of them were active participants in strategic disinformation, helping destabilize local narratives about sovereignty, resistance, and governance. These groups had media contacts, online influencers, and regional analysts on their payroll, spreading manipulated stories to deflect attention from cartel activity and smear anyone who attempted to investigate it. When Traoré began his rise as a nationalist figure standing against foreign dominance, these same NGOs published reports questioning his legitimacy, painting him as a threat to democracy. Now, in the aftermath of the raids, their silence was deafening. With evidence in hand, the Burkina government began revoking the licenses of dozens of such organizations, freezing their accounts and expelling their personnel. Those who had enjoyed diplomatic immunity were quietly placed under surveillance or publicly named in press conferences. The operation also exposed a new level of collusion involving foreign security firms contracted by NGOs and embassies. These firms provided armed escorts, encrypted radios, and aerial drones that were used not for security, but for mapping, smuggling routes, and avoiding military checkpoints. These private contractors, some of whom had ties to former intelligence officers from the West, were effectively running a parallel intelligence network across the Sahel, one that existed outside local law and accountability. Traoré's forces seized crates of military-grade gear, communications hardware, and tracking equipment from these so-called aid convoys. The implication was clear. Parts of the humanitarian architecture in West Africa had been militarized and weaponized to support the drug trade. This kind of infiltration wouldn't have been possible without local collaborators, some customs officials, border agents, and even members of regional task forces had been compromised. But rather than just arresting the lower ranks, the raid's objective was to map the chain of command to identify who was protecting whom and where the real decision-makers were based. Through a series of interrogations, phone taps, and financial audits, the Joint Task Force began building profiles of the cartel's upper echelon. These were not men hiding in shadows. They were investors, consultants, and emissaries attending global conferences, giving speeches about sustainable development, and donating to international think tanks Traoré's choice to work with. Interpol wasn't simply tactical, it was a legal maneuver. With Interpol's backing, Burkina Faso could bypass regional corruption, issue red notices, and freeze assets globally. The involvement of a neutral international body added legitimacy to the intelligence gathered and opened the doors for extraditions and sanctions. This meant that individuals hiding in European capitals or laundering money through Gulf states could now be held accountable in international courts. Interpol's Financial Crimes Division began building separate cases on the offshore accounts, working in tandem with global watchdogs like FATF and Egmont Group. The exposure of these foreign-backed cartels and fake squaw NGOs also triggered massive public awareness campaigns across Burkina Faso. Government-backed media began airing documentaries, whistleblower testimonies, and investigative breakdowns of how aid was being weaponized. Traoré made it clear that Burkina Faso was no longer a passive recipient of it. This was also a defining moment in shifting the psychological landscape of African governance. The symbolism of African boots on the ground, exposing, arresting, and dismantling a syndicate supported by foreign elements, sent shockwaves far beyond Burkina Faso. Across West Africa, leaders, analysts, and civil society activists watched as Traoré delivered what years of foreign interventions had failed to do. For the first time in recent memory, the people of the Sahel saw their own military forces not acting as proxies for foreign interests or merely containing unrest, but leading an offensive against the root of the chaos in international drug. Cartel entrenched in their territory, protected by corruption, and shielded by diplomatic ambiguity. What further underscored the shift was the level of intelligence coordination that occurred between regional allies. The success of the operation relied heavily on real-time data exchange between Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, and even civilian watch groups operating in border communities. In previous years, borders in the Sahel had acted as both escape routes and blind spots exploited by cartels and traffickers to avoid capture. But under Traoré's direction, cross-border units began communicating directly, bypassing bureaucracies and acting with urgency. For the first time, the region responded as a cohesive body, unified not by treaties or foreign summits, but by mutual survival and shared purpose. The operation also established a new model for legitimizing African-led security initiatives on the international stage. Rather than waiting for outside validation or permission, Traoré's government took the lead and invited global support only on its own terms. Interpol's involvement was strategic, giving Burkina Faso the legal authority to track, seize, and prosecute international actors involved in the syndicate without giving up command over the mission. This shift in dynamics, where global institutions assist African nations rather than dictate to, that marked a fundamental break from the neo-colonial patterns of security management that have long defined international involvement in Africa. At the same time, the operation raised critical questions about the future of African security. If one nation could pull off such a bold strike with limited resources and high-level resolve, what could a coordinated regional force achieve? The success of this raid is already inspiring renewed calls for an African-led transnational crime agency rooted in the continent's specific geopolitical realities. Many experts now argue that the African Union must take cues from what Traoré and his team demonstrated, that accountability, sovereignty, and intelligence must come from within. It's not from Western military installations or donor-driven tasks. Forces, moreover, the operation had a moral weight that resonated with everyday citizens, far beyond the realm of geopolitics. In the towns and villages where drug violence, trafficking, and kidnapping had become normalized. The image of African soldiers raiding foreign protected compounds and dragging out kingpins struck a chord. Not surrendered. That their leaders, if willing, could still stand up to the external forces corrupting their institutions. This created a ripple effect of belief not just in Traoré's leadership, but in the power of an African resurgence based on action, not rhetoric. This turning point also sent a chilling signal to those who had grown comfortable operating in the gray zones of African geopolitics. International smugglers, corrupt officials, and even intelligence-linked cartels that believed the Sahel would remain a safe corridor forever. Traoré's move upended that assumption. The new message is clear. The continent is watching, and it's no longer afraid to enforce its own laws with precision and strength. Africa is no longer just a battlefield for international forces to test their strategies. Architect of its own security doctrine. If you believe Africa's story should be told by those who live it, not those who exploit it, then hit that subscribe button right now. Like this video to amplify the truth, and drop your thoughts in the comments, because your voice matters in this fight for justice, sovereignty, and truth.